Hi there, Will here, and today I'd like to do something that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. What I have in front of me here is a digital scanning setup, a DSLR scanning setup, as it were. What that means is that the collection of things here will allow me to scan my film with a digital camera, and that's an idea that quite interests me because it's not something I've ever really tried properly before, outside of making like contact sheets with a light table and an iPhone, I think, from what I can remember. And my Imacon and most other film scanners are getting quite long in the tooth at this stage, so the idea of there being a reliable, high-quality backup that has a functionally infinite service life, since hopefully DSLRs continue to be a thing for quite some time yet, has an immense appeal to me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set this up, scan some things, and then we'll compare them to Imacon scans. To start off with, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the differences between a DSLR scanning setup and an Imacon scanner. They are quite drastic, and they do have an impact on the way that the quality is achieved, really, since the end goal of both setups is to have very good quality film scans. The Imacon just goes about it in a very refined, researched, and set up through many iterations sort of way, whereas the DSLR is a bit more bootleg. A DSLR scanning setup is essentially a camera mounted in a manner that allows it to be parallel to the film plane, or where you've got your film set up, and the film plane will have a light source below it so that enough light shines through the film for the camera to be able to see what's going on, and for the negative to actually be able to render its detail, because in order for you to view what's going on in a photographic negative, light needs to be shone through so that the silver halide crystals that have developed block the light that doesn't need to be shown, you know? That's the way it basically works. An Imacon scanner works in a completely different manner. It's what's called a virtual drum scanner. If you'd like a bit of a more thorough insight into its operation, I have a video which you can check out here talking about a higher end scanner than the one I'll be using here, since I'm using my personal one, but the functionality of it is basically the same. The way it works is the negative is mounted temporarily, but mounted quite solidly to a steel plate, flexible steel plate with a magnetic flap. This flap bites down softly but firmly enough to hold the negative in place onto the negative, and then it goes inside the machine and follows a path, either curves up or down depending on what model you have, since that did change at some point for whatever reason. And the light is shone through the negative and captured by a CCD sensor inside the scanner. The big difference between an Imacon and a DSLR scanning setup is, with a DSLR scanning setup, you're taking a picture of the whole negative in one go, whereas with an Imacon, the CCD is scanning line by line the data of the negative as it slowly moves past what amounts to a slit that shines the light through onto the sensor. It's not taking the entire negative into account in one moment. It takes time to scan the frame because the film needs to pass in front of this CCD sensor. What this means is that the Imacon is essentially tailored for ultimate sharpness. There is very little chance, if things are set up properly and the scanner is working properly, that there will ever be a lack of sharpness in terms of border-to-border sharpness in the frame. If you've got the right holder and it's actually pinching down the negative all around, because what can happen if you've got an aftermarket holder, or you're using the wrong holder for the wrong type of negative, is that it won't pinch all around, and then as it's going through, the negative will curve at the bottom because it's not being pinched. So if, for example, you're scanning a 6x7 frame in a 6x9 holder, and the frame is a single frame, it's gonna touch at the top and the edges, but the bottom will be loose, and it makes a huge impact on sharpness at the bottom because everywhere else on the frame is going to be being held perfectly flat, and then at the bottom, where nothing is touching it, it's gonna curve. And where it curves, it isn't in line with the scanner's understanding of where it needs to be scanning for sharpness, and thus that element will be out of focus. So if you've got an Imacon set up correctly and are using the correct holder, there isn't a way that I know of that it's going to scan inaccurately, basically. Everything will be sharp, there is no doubt about it. Whereas with a DSLR scanning setup, you're subject to variations in the flatness of your film. And the setup I was using here from Valoy does have a negative holder designed specifically for holding 120 film, and that is what I used, but there was definitely some variation in terms of how level it was across the frame. I'll put together a comparison for you to show you here how exactly an Imacon holder looks and how exactly the Valoy holder looks. In theory, they work the same way by pinching down the negative across the frame, but the difference is the Valoy is rigid and sits still. So the film goes in and then it's held rigidly flat, quote unquote, and is assumed to be scanning things sharp in that manner, whereas what the Imacon does and how it actually negates the problems that arise from a rigid setup like that is its bendiness means that the film is always taut. So even if there's an element of it which isn't sharp at some point as it goes through, which could happen, I don't know, I've never noticed because that's not what actually gets scanned. Even if there's an element of it that isn't sharp, the holder is designed so that in its tautness, as it's at its flattest and being held as tight as it possibly can, is when it passes past the sensor and actually gets scanned. So there's just no chance for it not to be sharp. However, all of this being said, the DSLR scanning setup that I used netted some pretty surprising results in certain circumstances, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Having said what I've said now about the Imacon compared to the DSLR scanner, one would assume that the DSLR is kind of doomed to be inferior because it just isn't functioning on the same level really, and that has been my understanding of it for the longest time. I mean, I have mentioned in past videos that in my opinion a high-end DSLR scanning setup could compete with an Imacon, but I didn't really expect things to be as competitive as they've turned out here. What do you want, eh? What do you want? Cat thinks the Imacon is better too, don't you, Cat? For a brief overview of setting up the DSLR kit, it is catastrophically easy, really. I mean, I didn't look at any guides or anything online. I did try, but I couldn't find anything, and in my impatience, I just decided that after 10 seconds of Googling, if I can't find the answer I want, I'm just going to keep going. And I did end up, I think, pretty much bang on with how it's meant to be set up. I mean, the results will speak for themselves, I guess. I'm obviously not going to show you the whole setup process here because it took about an hour, I think. If you want to watch it, I'll probably upload it to my Buy Me a Coffee. And once things were set up, all that was left to do was select some negatives. Now, because the end result for these scans is going to be print, I'd like for the pictures to be as glorious as possible. So I'm going to try pick some zingers and make them as nice as I can, and hopefully, possibly, potentially, they will be comparable to the Imacon results. I mean, it's not like I've ever manually inverted things before, so the colors might potentially be an issue because of the manual inversion, but also because digital cameras just can't process RA4 color the same way as an Imacon. But I think this is the perfect opportunity to test myself and see if I can make a digital scan thing look as nice as it has the capacity to. The big caveat with this video, I suppose, is that I'm scanning with an incredibly high-end medium format digital camera. The reason that I did this is not because I think everyone's going to be scanning their negatives with an incredibly high-end digital medium format camera, but rather because I'm interested in knowing if there is an alternative to the Imacon, because aside from all its positives that I've mentioned, there are many downsides to it, and the largest one of those is the fact that for me it's impossible to have it serviced. I can try and service it myself if anything ever goes wrong, but at the end of the day, where I exist in the world, if my Imacon decides to die in a catastrophic way, that'll be the end of it, unfortunately. And what that means is I'm quite interested in having viable alternatives, and to me, the most viable alternative that could come to mind was a medium format DSLR scanning setup. So this is what this is, essentially, is me trying to find out whether a medium format DSLR scanning kit can compete with the Imacon. To preface this, I'd just like to point out that I am not purporting to be any sort of world-class expert on what I'm talking about. I'm just a guy who happens to have access to both of these things, or briefly had access to the GFX because it was a short-lived excursion simply for the sake of this and making the pictures. The Imacon I do know substantially more about, but again, I'm not purporting to be any kind of expert, so please don't do what Cats did on the last video and come and swang wang and like say mean things, a lot of the time being incorrect in your mean things just for the sake of it, If I'm wrong about something, please inform people. I'm sure folks will be very interested to know about your insights in the comments. Just don't be a dick. The first thing I'm going to do is show you how I set all of these up to work on, which is by stacking them for exposure, because what I noticed with my tests initially was that if I just used one straight scan from the GFX, it didn't have a comparable dynamic range to the Imacon, so I decided to give it its best chance of competing. I'd stack the exposures. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'll show you how I did that, and then I'll move into the inversion process, which is also not particularly tricky, but I'm sure there are some of you who'd be interested to know. What I'm going to do when they've all loaded in here, give it a second, my computer is not the fastest, is I'm going to disable these two, add a layer mask to each of them, go image, apply image, merge them, image, apply image, merge this one, bring them both back into existence, flatten it, and it's as simple as that. Now I've got a merged stacked exposure, basically. The next step is I'm going to use Alex Burke's inversion method. I mean, you could also just go, ooh, whoop, that's not what I wanted to do. You could also just go Control I and it would invert it. But I don't know, I like having control over things, and it feels like I'm more in charge if I'm using curves. So take that up, bring that down, go eyedropper, oops, not on curves, select the rebate color from the background, Control Shift N for a new layer, enter, make sure that layer is above the curves layer, otherwise it's going to be inverted, shift backspace so that paste the foreground color on top, and then in the modifications to the layer I'm going to go subtract, and now I've got an inverted picture. The only adjustments I do from here on out would be levels and curves, or just curves, adjusting, I don't know, things to be more red, things to be more cyan, things to be less cyan, things to be warmer, things to be more magenta, you know, just in curves. That's all I do, which is why every time anyone has ever asked me to make a video on color balancing, I've been hesitant to do it because there's nothing really particularly impressive that I do. I just tweak around with it like this. I mean, obviously I spend a bit more time doing it than I've spent here, but there's not really that much more to it than what I'm showing you here. Anyway, now that you know how I got there, I think it's time for me to show you some scans. We'll start off with my favorite frame because, I don't know, this is one of my favorite pictures I've ever made, and the rendering is actually probably more favorable towards the GFX. In terms of color, this is the GFX, this is the Imacon. There's definitely a substantial difference in contrast. That's got nothing to do with the scanners or the scanning method. That's entirely my own preference because, I don't know, for the GFX I kind of like the way it ended up here more than I like the way it ended up here. In terms of raw sharpness, this is where things get interesting. If we go to 100% on the GFX and 50% on the Imacon, because the GFX file is about 50% the size of the Imacon file. You can have your own thoughts on that. And compare the way these doohickeys look. The GFX smokes the Imacon in sharpness and in color rendering, basically. I mean, you can see this sort of shadow area over here on the Imacon gets very mushy and noisy, whereas on the GFX, crisp, clean, just turns into a clean sort of shadow fall off thing. Raw sharpness, GFX also wins. The caveat being, this is 100% zoom, this is 100% zoom, so the Imacon is clearly bigger. If I were to upscale it, because the GFX on the long end is 9,000 pixels, and the Imacon is 17,000, if I send this to 17,000, we can have a more direct comparison. Also, you may be saying to yourself, hang on, I've heard about other people scanning with GFXs and getting 11,000 pixels on the long end. That is the capacity of the sensor. However, with the macro that I was using, I couldn't get it to scan that large because it just doesn't focus close enough. Like 9,000 pixels is pretty much the upper end of the limit of what I could get things to focus at. So that's what we have to compare with here. So just so you know, this is an upscaled GFX scan now, just for the sake of curiosity. Obviously, this is just digitally made bigger, and I don't know, starts to look like the Imacon wins here, because this is still grain from the negative itself, whereas here we're starting to bring in digital noise. I'm nitpicking here though. There's not much else one can say outside of the fact that they are completely comparable, and that the one is an archaic dinosaur of a machine that's going to die at some point, and the other is a infinitely usable format that's only going to get cheaper, because surely at some point medium format cameras are going to start costing less. Please, hopefully. Anyway, I'll show you some more things. This obviously, as I said, was more favorable towards the GFX. This next one is more favorable towards the Imacon. And that's sort of the way things go here. Some of them scan better on the Imacon, some of them scan better on the GFX. Across the board though, the Imacon does have a more consistent sharpness and color rendering. Can't really say whether that's me or the GFX. In all honesty, it's probably me. My DSLR scanning setup was definitely not the most stable, and is obviously way more prone to user error than an Imacon, because the Imacon does it all yourself. But there were some interesting things that happened, and that's what I want to talk about here. With this B picture, let me just zoom this out to 50%. Look at this gradient on the Imacon. You can see the bokeh sort of turns into softer greens and then into this gray thing at the back. The GFX, it does this. It's pretty weird, and I don't know, from my understanding, it's something to do with the way the GFX interprets greens, and not me butchering the grade, or that it doesn't respond well to being tweaked, because if I go to the raw file again here, invert the raw file, go to the 100% zoom there, you can see it is still happening. I mean, obviously it pops more in this grade because the colors pop more because of the way I've tweaked things with levels and curves, but it's still there. There's like you can see it now that I brought the levels down, a weird freaking thing happening here, and I don't know what the explanation for it is outside of the way that the GFX interprets screens. And the reason that is my explanation is because there are other contexts where its interpretation of greens has been interesting to me. Pretty much what I'm seeing happened, or have noted to happen, and what my interpretation of it is that the GFX has truer colors. Like this is definitely truer to life than the greens in the Imacon. This is the Imacon. This is the GFX. The GFX is more accurate from what I can see and what I remember. The Imacon has an Imacon rendering. I enjoy the Imacon's rendering, but the GFX is definitely more true to life, okay? And what I think is that somewhere in the true to life and the greens and yellows, its interpretation of certain RA4 gradients gets lost. Like, for example, in that B picture, because the GFX color science is made by someone that understands modern digital camera color science and needs it to be interpreted in a way that can write super fast for massive files. And I don't know, maybe the way people think about colors are different now, but the Imacon's colors were set up by some mad genius in the Hasselblad factory during the peak of the RA4 color space, or film color being the thing, and thus its understanding of the gradient that is achievable with film is better. That is the way I'm thinking of it. This is based on nothing but my own observation. If you've got a better reason for that weird sort of loss of gradient on the GFX, please let me know. I would love to know. Anyway, comparing raw sharpness here. This is the sharpest point on either of these. Obviously, I need to zoom out the Imacon. They're both hella sharp. If we look at the leaves on this tree and compare them to the leaves on this tree, in both of the frames you can see there's leaves on the tree and that they are leaves. In this frame, the GFX does a better job of rendering them because it's cleaner. You can see there's more color noise going on in the Imacon. Again, GFX is sharper. Sometimes it isn't sharper. I reckon I've given you enough of an overview of both systems now, and it's time for some verdicts. The most prevalent difference between these two systems is the fact that the Fuji DSLR kit took me about an hour to set up, and getting my Imacon working once I bought it took about 6 months, which involved building varying computers to get it to work, trying different types of software, modifying the scanner itself eventually in the end by filing pieces off the chassis so I could access bits of the motherboard that weren't really meant to be accessed, but that is in fact the only way that mine works. So there's no comparison for ease of use and setup. The other thing that is leagues apart between the two of them is the fact that the scanning time for a max res frame on the Fuji is about a 15th of a second if you take into account the fact that it's 3 exposures of a 60th of a second each. Whereas on my Imacon, it takes about 20 minutes for a max res frame, and on a faster Imacon like the X5, it would take about 2 minutes. So it's leagues ahead in terms of speed, the Fuji. In terms of raw sharpness, the Fuji is sharper than my Imacon 343. The catch there is the fact that the 343 is definitely sharper border to border consistently. There's no variation in that because of the way that the holder is set up, whereas the Fuji is subject to change, both in terms of your mounting system and the fact that the holder isn't quite as elegant in the way it holds things. But the Imacon has a substantially bigger file. The file size of my Imacon at max res, as I said, is 17,000 pixels. And it has Imacon color going for it, which, as I mentioned, is only a slight difference in certain circumstance, but the fact of the matter is that the Imacon is capable of rendering things that the Fuji sometimes does not seem to be able to render. Other downsides for the Imacon are the fact that it's a dinosaur at this point and temperamental, and going to die at some point. Whereas the Fuji setup is basically infinitely usable with that Valoy scanning kit, because you can just swap out cameras as soon as the next greatest thing comes along. The only real way I'd want to refine it in terms of making it my main setup would be to figure out a way to absolutely consistently have the frame be totally flat, which there are ways that people have worked out to do. I just obviously was using the default kit from Valoy, which is a very good kit, and I mean, this video isn't sponsored by them. They didn't send it to me to talk about. It's in my possession for a completely different reason, which will hopefully become apparent at some point in the near future, but it's really good, and that's just my honest take. It's not a review about that kit, but I mean, if I can set it up in an hour and get usable results, then I'm happy with it. So taking all of that into account, I'm pretty sure the Fuji has a lot more going for it than the Imacon, unfortunately, and honestly, I can safely say that I'm pretty confident in saying that the Fuji is better, with the catch being that it does have a smaller file size and the color rendering is sometimes not quite as good as the Imacon. The results, however, are exquisitely usable, and if I could own a Fuji GFX, I'd probably consider going that way as my main scanning setup. The only hold-up for me would be the color thing, but I'm pretty sure if I had more than a couple of days to tinker with it, I could figure something out. And that's not to say that I don't love my Imacon. My Imacon's given me many years of good service at this stage. Its colors are unparalleled still. Its file size is substantially bigger than the Fuji. I just think if one happened to be in a position right now where they were trying to decide between buying an Imacon or figuring out a really nice DSLR scanning setup, I would recommend the DSLR scanning setup because it's got a lot more potential going forward than an Imacon does. As I mentioned earlier, the catch in this is, of course, the fact that the DSLR on this DSLR scanning kit is a Fuji GFX. So what I reckon I'll do is, at some point in the near future, if there's any interest, source a more consumer level DSLR or mirrorless camera and then test it compared to the Fuji. Obviously, I wouldn't rent the Fuji again because it's an extremely expensive thing, even just to rent, but I could compare the scans, which is the important part in all of this. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. A big thank you, as always, to the members of my Buy Me a Coffee for supporting this channel, and for anyone who has supported the channel by buying me a coffee on Buy Me a Coffee at any stage. And I'll see you next week.